What's up guys, Filterless here. In this video we're going to be comparing a bunch of different games with fluid motion frames on versus off, and can you see which one has fluid motion frames turned on? Do you think it is the left one or the right side? Also, the footage was recorded at 120 FPS, so you can see here at 50% speed we're still able to see 60 FPS, so it'll be nice and smooth so we can see some of the differences. And we are running 900p, 5 gigs of VRAM, CPU boost is on. This is the Z1 Extreme Ally, and we're running the AMD driver 23.40. It's the preview driver, and we are running BIOS 336. So which one do you think here has fluid motion frames turned on? We'll go ahead and go back to real speed. And would it surprise you if we were running 15 watts on the left with fluid motion frames on and 30 watts on the right with it turned off? And that kind of goes to show just how much of a difference it does make in the smoothness, because in some of the areas the left side looked a bit better and we're at about half the power. And I wanted to do two more of these tests real quick. So one of these is 15 watts fluid motion frames, the other one is 30 watts with it turned off. And can you guess which one it is? Do you think it's the left side or the right side? Or do they look about the same? We'll even slow it down to 50% here so you can take a look. And last chance to guess. And we were running 15 watts on the right with fluid motion frames and 30 watts on the left with it turned off. And we're going to get into the charts and everything else here in a second. I just thought these were a couple fun tests to run. And just as one last test, would you think this is about the same in frame rate and smoothness? And which one do you think has fluid motion frames on? And which one do you think has it off between both of these? We'll even speed it up here for a second, and then we can even slow it down a little bit so you can see the differences. Now, would it surprise you if we were running 12 watts with fluid motion frames on the right and 30 watts with it turned off on the left? So that shows where fluid motion frames does have a use case, because over here it's looking pretty good. Even slowing this down to 50% speed, you can see how smooth it is at just 12 watts. And for our first game, we're running Metro Exodus 900p on all these. Here's the settings we're using. And for all these tests, we have fluid motion frames turned off on the left and we have it turned on the right. Down here in the middle, you can see we have 12 watts. So it's going to show what watts we're testing. We're going to be testing 12 watts, 15 watts, and 30 watts at 900p. And to quickly go over the chart, you can see our base FPS here. This is the chart that I built, and then this is the AMD overlay. And you can see the FPS over here on the AMD overlay matches the FPS right here on this chart since it's not generating frames. However, over here you can see we're at 29 FPS for the base, or around 27, but we're getting 55. So this is showing the fluid motion frame rate. So it's going to be a bit higher, and that's how we can see not only how much we're losing. So you can see here we went from about 35 to 29 by activating it, but then we can see the difference in how many frames are actually being generated over here. And one of the first things I want to point out is right here on this tank, if you take a look, you can see how much smoother it is with those fluid motion frames. So if we rewind a little bit, you can see this is a bit jittery looking, and then down here it's nice and smooth. However, you'll see in this faster motion that we're about to see, this is actually going to kick completely off, and this is frequent when you have a low base frame rate. And if you take a look right here, it's kind of hard to see, but right now fluid motion frames is activated, and you can see just how smooth it is up here versus over here it's a bit more jittery. And AMD overlay shows 30 FPS, however it is definitely activated right here, so this lags behind quite a bit. And even through most of this animation, you will see it's still generating the frames right here. So it's a little bit smoother, but as soon as we make this really fast turn, you can see how smooth this is. If you look over here on the right versus over here, but as soon as he makes this turn right here, there we go. It just kicked completely off. Extremely jittery for basically the rest of this whole animation. So even when he goes down in the tunnel, you can see we're still pretty low in FPS. It's not actually working. And one last thing that's important here at 12 watts, you can see we're at about 37 milliseconds of frame time delay. And over here, we're only at 22 milliseconds. However, you can see right here, frame generation lag. This is additional lag is at 75 milliseconds. And you combine both of these to get your total delay. This is added to the frame time. You can see our frame time is lower because we're at higher FPS, but you have to add in the frame gen lag to the frame time. So we're getting about 96, 97 milliseconds of delay over here versus about 37 on the left. So that is pretty substantial. Then here we are at 15 watts. And once again, a great place to look is the tank. So we'll do this at real-time speed. You can see how smooth it is. We'll do half speed. It's a little bit easier to see, but you can see just how much smoother it is as we're panning down. And we're at about 40 FPS here on the left with frame generation turned off, and about 67 with it turned on. Now the delay has been cut down substantially. Now we're at about 25 milliseconds over here on the left. However, we're at about 67 over here on the right hand side. So that is still quite a bit more, but they've both been cut down quite a bit. Even on our base frame rate here, you can see we're at around 50 for the average, now 49, and we went down to 39. So we're losing a bit on that base frame rate. One last thing I wanted to point out here, you can see as the bag is swinging over here, it's a bit blurry, and then it's pretty clear over here. And even with the watch, if we rewind really slowly, you can see frame generation doesn't really know what to do with some of those frames. So you're going to get a slightly more muddy and blurry image like you're seeing right here. Now here at 30 watts, we are getting a substantial bump with fluid motion frames. You can see here as we're coming down over 100 FPS on the right and about 60 or so on the left. And we're still taking a pretty big hit with the base frame rate going from 66 to 54. And one other thing that surprised me is I thought the frame time graph from previous videos I had seen would be all over the place with fluid motion frames on. So right here we can see if we're getting any jitter or stutters, and it's actually pretty smooth. I thought this would be really bad. Like we can see little stutters here, and it's actually really stable, a lot more stable than I thought it would be. And then here we have the Metro Exodus chart. So here's 12 watts, 15 watts, 30 watts, and you can see this white bar goes up to without fluid motion frames. Then right below it, we have the fluid motion frames benchmark. The green bars are the FPS, so you can see we're getting a nice bump. And then the red bars are the lag that we're getting. So this is the total lag. So here we're at about 35 milliseconds of delay. And then over here we have 94 milliseconds. Keep in mind, there's also latency between the screen, the actual controls themselves. So this would be a little bit higher, but this is just the metric that we're using that we can actually see and measure. And so 35 to 94, that's a huge difference. I remember the old TVs would be up near 100 and you could really feel it when you were playing games. So that's kind of what you experience here at almost 100. Now going to 15 watts, you can see it was cut down quite a bit, going from 35 to 25 without frame gen, and we went from 29 to 40 FPS. And then with frame generation, it wasn't a substantial bump in FPS, but look at the delay. It was cut down quite a bit, going down to 67. And then here at 30 watts, we're down to 20 milliseconds at about 49 FPS with frame generation off. And with it on, we're at 83 FPS, but we're still getting 53 milliseconds of delay. The most important part to look at, I think, is 12 watts with frame generation off, we're getting about 35 milliseconds. Then at 30 watts with frame generation on, we're getting about 53. So even though that FPS is 83 versus 29, the game would feel quite a bit more responsive here at 12 watts with frame generation off. Next up, we have Dying Light, and we are just running the balanced quality preset. And here at 12 watts, you can see we're not getting a very good base frame rate on either, about 27 on the left with it off and 23 on the right. Our delay is pretty substantial, even on the left, getting around 35 milliseconds. However, on the right, we are getting close to 50 FPS at times. However, the 95 milliseconds or so of delay over here on the right is quite a bit. You're definitely going to feel that. And then here at 15 watts, you can see the difference. If you look right here at the little phone booth, as we pass it, it's a bit more smooth on the right, and we are getting about 70 FPS. Versus on the left, we're getting about 43. Another thing to note, our base frame rate is taking a pretty big hit across the board. So 42 to 35. Our delay is about 21 milliseconds with frame generation off. We're getting about 59 milliseconds of delay over here on the right with it on. Also, the GPU utilization, the temperatures, RAM, and even the CPU utilization is pretty close across the board. Now I've zoomed into 150%, and if you look right here on this balcony and these windows, you can see it stays pretty clear over here. And then if we take a look at the right, you can see kind of what frame generation's doing. So it's adding these frames in, and that's where you get that more muddied look. Versus over here, it's just a bit clearer, but we are getting smoother motion over here on the right. And then here at 30 watts, we're getting almost 100 FPS. You saw 98 there versus about 55 or so on the left. Our frame time lag has been cut down quite a bit at about 17, 18 milliseconds over here on the left. and right at 45 milliseconds on the right. And something I wanted to point out here, at this higher frame rate, you can see the windows are clear and then they go blurry, clear, blurry over and over again. And I found it to be more apparent as the frame rate was higher, which is a bit strange. You can see over here on the left, it's just a lot clearer than what we're getting over here on the right with it doing that blur effect over and over again. And the winner for this chart is definitely going to be this delay here. It actually beat out the FPS with frame generation down here. So 103 milliseconds of delay. That is very substantial, something you'll definitely feel when playing. And then going up to 15 watts, you can see a substantial decrease both with frame generation off, going from 37 to 23, but especially from 103 down to 65 milliseconds. We're getting 44 FPS at 15 watts with frame generation off and 70 with it on. And then at 30 watts, we were at around 59, so close to 60 FPS at 17 milliseconds of delay. And with frame generation on, we're at almost 100, so 98 FPS, but we're still getting 46 milliseconds of delay. And once again, 12 watts with frame generation off has a lower delay than 30 watts with it on. Next, we have Skyrim running 900p. We're doing medium settings, and we have TAA on. And here at 12 watts, we're at 50% speed, and if you look, it's quite a bit smoother with frame generation on. We're getting about 67 versus 42. And here at normal speed, you can still see the difference. So we'll just speed it up a little bit till we make this turn up here. And when we make this turn, it might look pretty close, but if we look at the trees, you will see it's actually a bit smoother over here on the right. So you can see this like flashing over here. It's just the low frame rate. And then if we look over here, it is definitely smoother for sure. And here's a pretty interesting section. It seems to not like what's going on right here. You can see these rocks and you can definitely see it glitching out a bit right here. And then as soon as we get around these rocks, so here's real time, you can see it's back to normal. Has almost no issues. You really can't even tell now. So frame generation is just a bit strange with how it works. And then here at 15 watts, they're looking very close actually. I'm really not seeing much of a difference, and it is hard to show through recordings. When you're on the display, it is going to be different when you have 60 FPS versus 100, especially with VRR. However, at 70 FPS base frame rate at 15 watts, you're really not going to see it too much anyway, and it's going to be really smooth on the Ally with that VRR. And here in our average FPS, we're losing about 15 FPS, even though we have those generated frames. But you can see here, it's only 70 to 100, so only 30 additional FPS, whereas in Dying Light, we were seeing almost double. And here at 30 watts, we're at about 35 milliseconds or so of lag versus about 12. And you can see for our base frame rate, that is a massive hit, going from basically 80 to 65, so 79, 64. Then here on Skyrim at 30 watts, and we're getting outside of the 120 FPS range of even the recording and what you'd be able to see on the Ally, and we're getting about 80 over here with it off. We are getting a pretty big hit still with the base frame rate, so we're going from 77 FPS, 78 to 63. However, the lag would be much more manageable here at about 35 milliseconds with frame generation and about 12 or so with it off. And I wanted to drop this in here for a second. This is actually 12 watts on the left, and you can see we're at about 22, 23, 22 milliseconds. So this is still 35, and this is at 12 watts over here and 30 on the right. So that is pretty crazy that it is adding that much latency with the frame generation. And then here on our Skyrim chart, we're getting about 42 FPS at 12 watts with 24 milliseconds of delay. With frame generation turned on, it did bump the FPS up quite a bit, but if you look at the lag, it increased quite a bit more than the FPS increase. So now we're at like 68 milliseconds, but you can see that massive jump, whereas our FPS was a much smaller jump. Then going to 15 watts, we're getting right in the 60s, a little over 60 and 16 milliseconds with frame generation off, and we're getting 97 with it turned on, which is pretty high. And then about 47 milliseconds of delay. At 30 watts, it's cut down even more, and we're getting 75 frames per second. And this is ridiculous. 118 was actually going outside of the FreeSync range in the Ally's display of 120 hertz. And the latency was reduced quite a bit with frame generation on. So we're at 38 milliseconds. So while it looks extremely smooth at the 30 watts with frame generation, the game will feel more responsive once again at 12 watts without frame generation. So when you make an input, it's going to feel faster at 12 watts here than at 30 watts with the frame generation. Next, we have The Witcher 3 running medium preset with quality for FSR instead of auto. And here are the rest of the settings. And here's slowed down at 12 watts, and we can see quite a big difference. And the little artifacting we're seeing really wouldn't be bothersome until you're doing fast motion. So here's the real-time test, and we can see it is kicking off occasionally. It just doesn't have that frame rate to stay on. And as an example, I'll show you what kicking off is. If we do half speed here, you will see it's about to start to stutter right there. It is not actually activated, then it's activated once again. So that's what you'll get when you're at a lower frame rate and you're panning the camera quickly, which is an unfortunate thing. I would probably rather it just stay on so you don't have a mixed experience, even if it gives you a bit more artifacting. And here the latency, I would say, is a pretty big deal. We are at 86 right here for just the frame gen lag, and then 25 for the frame time lag. So that is pretty substantial. And our base frame rate is pretty low. We're at about 20 over here with it on, and still really low in the 20s even with it off. Here at 15 watts, things definitely start picking up a bit. So here at real time, you can see where it's a lot smoother when the camera's not panning extremely fast. This is still kicking off occasionally, which is when you're seeing that heavy stutter. And we're at about 33 versus 55. So that is pretty impressive how high it is. And even over here with it off, getting over 30 FPS, you're going to be in the low frame rate compensation for the Ally. So it's going to look pretty good even with VSync off. However, this is approaching about 80 milliseconds of delay over here versus about 30 on the left. At 30 watts, our base frame rate's holding up pretty well at about 43 versus 38. If we slow it down, you can see it's a bit smoother for sure over here, getting about 77 with the generated frames versus about 43. Our lag has even dropped down quite a bit, just at a little over 50 milliseconds over here on the right and about 20 over here on the left. And here we're at half speed, and you can just look at the differences between them and see which one you think. I think they both look pretty good, but that extra smoothness is nice at over 80 right now FPS on the frame generation. And here on the chart, we can see at 12 watts, that delay is way up there at around 110 milliseconds. Even with frame generation off at 23 FPS, that's still really not playable. So neither one of these would be an enjoyable experience. 44 milliseconds is also quite a bit of delay. However, at 15 watts, things improve quite a bit, and we're getting in the 30s with 29 milliseconds of delay. With frame generation, it's actually quite a nice bump, getting almost double the FPS, but with 74 milliseconds of delay, going up to 30 watts, and now we're in the 40s, which is very playable at around 22 milliseconds, which should provide a pretty good experience. And when you kick frame generation on, you'll be in the 80s at around 54 milliseconds. So this could be playable for some people as you get to that higher watt range, but at the lower watt ranges, this is just way too much in my opinion to enjoy the experience. Next up, we have Resident Evil 4. We're running the balance preset at 900p. Fidelity super resolution is turned off, and here's the rest of the settings. And here at 12 watts, it's not going to be too playable, and either here is real time. It is a bit smoother on the right. However, I just want to freeze here. We're at about 50 milliseconds of delay on the left and around 120 on the right. So that is a lot of delay. However, it is pretty impressive that even at this lower frame rate, we're getting 37 on the right and 22 on the left. And it does visibly look a lot better. It's just that lag would be a bit too much. And here, as soon as we leave the shack, I'm going to go at half speed so I can show you all this, and you can just see some of this distortion right here. However, it is quite a bit smoother. We're getting 50 something FPS versus about 30. And you can even see the smoothness over here despite it kind of glitching out a bit. Even for our base frame rate, we're at about 31, 32 for the average versus 28. So we're not really losing a whole lot with frame generation on. You can see our FPS is almost double, getting about 33 milliseconds of delay versus about 80 over here. Now at 30 watts, it's handling this a lot better. So this turn right here, it's definitely working better with a higher base frame rate. And we're in the 70s now with frame generation versus about 42 or so, right at 40 with it off. The delay is also getting to a somewhat manageable level at about 65 versus about 26. And the chart here looks pretty close to the Witcher 3 chart. If we switch back and forth, you can see the values are pretty close. It is impressive at 12 watts, we're getting 40 FPS, but that 109 milliseconds of delay is definitely going to kill the experience a bit. But even with frame gen off at the 21 FPS and almost 50 milliseconds of delay, that's also not going to be the greatest experience. So bumping it up to 15 watts, we see now we're in the 30s with frame generation turned off, around 30 milliseconds of delay. We're getting almost double the FPS when frame gen's turned on, getting 60 FPS, but at 74 milliseconds of delay. And then going up to 30 watts, we're now in the 40s with about 23 milliseconds of delay. And then turning frame gen on, we get up to 76 FPS, but we are still close to 60 milliseconds of delay. And I think that's just going to be a bit too much once again. Next, we have Resident Evil 2. We're running balance. This game is a lot less demanding, 900p, and we are running ultra quality for FSR. And here's the rest of the settings if you're interested in seeing them. And this game at 12 watts actually works pretty well. So here we are in real time, and it's definitely going to be a bit smoother here on the right. It's a little bit harder to pick up in this darker environment, but we are around 68 FPS, around 70 on the right and about 40 on the left. So that's a pretty big difference. And something else that's interesting about this, if we look at our average FPS, we're losing quite a bit. So it's 41 to 33, but that is a massive loss at this lower frame rate. And we're at a little over 70 milliseconds of delay over here versus about 22 over here on the left. And take a look at the FPS right here. We're at about 70, and you're going to watch it's about to kick off. It's already kicking off. Now we're back down to about 40 something, and it seems like it continues to try to generate frames, or it could just be lag in the overlay, but it does kick off from that fast motion. And then here at 15 watts, this game is very playable even without frame generation. You can see we're right near 60 FPS, about 16 milliseconds of delay, and with frame generation we're at over 90, but we are getting about 50 milliseconds of delay. And once again, the performance hit is pretty massive on that base frame rate, about 11 FPS. So 60, you see now 60 to 48. Now, one of the most surprising things to me is the frame time graph is not spiking a lot. I figured with frame generation we'd get a lot less stability. However, that does not seem to be the case at all when looking at these. I thought it would be massive spikes and all over the place. It actually looks pretty good. Here at 30 watts, we are maintaining a frame rate above even the recording frame rate. You see 140 right there versus about 80. So on both of these, extremely playable. And frame generation is pretty exciting just because with a high refresh rate monitor, I absolutely see the use case if they can get that latency fixed. Speaking of latency, we are at about 12 over here on the left and about 34, 35 over here on the right. Once again, pretty big hit in the frame rate average, 84 down to 69. But if we slow it down, you take a look at the plant here. So I'm going to rewind it and then take a look at that plant. And you'll see it's a lot smoother than over here on the left. So even right here, that extra frame rate does seem to smoothen things out quite a bit. And for the Resident Evil 2 chart, this is where it gets a bit more practical when we have this higher frame rate right off the bat. So at 12 watts, we're getting 41 FPS without frame generation, and then we're getting almost 70, so 68 with frame generation turned on, and we're at about 60 milliseconds versus about 25 milliseconds with it turned off. And then here at 15 watts, we're at 60 FPS, and then turning frame gen on gets us right at 100. The 17 milliseconds of delay is going to provide an awesome experience though versus the almost 50 with frame gen turned on. And then at 30 watts, we're in the 80s without frame gen, and it goes all the way up to 140 when we turn frame generation on. And the delay on both of these is actually pretty good. Even with frame generation, we're right at 34 milliseconds. One of the big issues though is we are outside the FreeSync range at this 140 FPS on the Ally. And so if you have Resident Evil 2 and you actually tried this out, you would probably prefer the 86 FPS because it's still really smooth to the 140, because once you go outside of that FreeSync range, you're going to be able to see it. And the 12 milliseconds is going to give you a very snappy experience compared to around mid 30s. Next, we have Insurgency Sandstorm at 900p running the medium preset. Here's the rest of the settings if you want to look at them. And you'll see right here as we go down the steps, we're at about 50, but this is going to drop down. It's basically going to kick off. Even right here where it's not super fast motion, it seems to still drop off for a minute. And it definitely seems to be a bit smoother over here at around 55 FPS versus 35. So an additional 20 FPS. We're at about 27 milliseconds of delay over here and about 80 on the right. And here's a really good example of just the smoothness, even though it's blurrier. If you look over here, you can see a bit of jitter. And then if you look right here, it's just a lot smoother. Then at 15 watts, we're getting almost 90, and it won't kick off as we go down the steps now. So it's just going to stay on. We did dip down to about 70, but it didn't kick all the way off and bring us down to 45. And so you can see we're at almost 90 FPS versus around 55 over here on the left. And it does make a pretty big difference in that smoothness. However, our delay now is about 17 on the left and about 50 on the right, so still quite a bit. And in something like this game, I personally prefer the lower latency. You want as little lag as possible. And I found with frame generation on, it's just a bit too much delay. And here at 30 watts, you can see we're doubling over double the frame rate for a second there. It was like 120, almost 130 to 60, but it is way higher for whatever reason. We're at about 75 here. We'll speed it up a little bit, and 70 to like 130. And I will say, seeing 130 something in Insurgency at 900p medium settings is pretty amazing. You can see our delay has dropped down to about 12 milliseconds, and we are still at over 35 here on the right, or right at 35. I think what would be amazing to see is having the frame gen lag be what the frame time is. If it just doubled the frame time, that would be a great experience in my opinion. And here on the Insurgency chart, we can see at 12 watts, we're in the mid 30s without frame gen and about 56 with frame gen turned on. Once again, the delay going from about 29 milliseconds to 82 milliseconds. Then at 15 watts, this is a really good experience, whether you use 15 or even 17. But at 15, we're at 60 FPS pretty much with 17 milliseconds of delay. With frame gen on, that goes all the way up to 94 frames per second. So a nice bump, but we're still at 50 milliseconds of lag. Then at 30 watts, we're at 75 FPS and 13 milliseconds with frame generation turned off. Really great experience. And what's crazy is how high the FPS goes with it on. 131 FPS with frame gen on at 30 watts and something like Insurgency Sandstorm. That is pretty impressive. And the delay is not that bad. We're at 36 milliseconds. Once again, though, we would be going outside that FreeSync range with frame gen on at 30 watts. Next, we have Horizon Zero Dawn, and here's the settings we're using. And we're using the original preset that's actually defaulted to a pretty intense preset. We're getting extremely low FPS. And one thing that's really surprising with this game is the base frame rate is very close. So we're getting almost 40 FPS here on the right and about 22 on the left. And I'm not sure how well it's being picked up on YouTube, but it was really surprising how smooth it was at 12 watts versus what we're getting here on the left. This game seems to like frame generation for whatever reason. However, that frame time delay is massive. We're at about 45 over here, and now we're hitting about 130. That's crazy. Let's rewind it just a little bit and freeze. 102 milliseconds for just the frame generation lag, and then another 30 on top of that for the frame time. Now 50 is not great either, but that is just crazy to see that number on a frame time. And then you'll see here on this final turn, I'll do real-time speed, and you see it's a lot smoother over here on the right. So you can see this is just kind of jumping around a bit, and this is very smooth. So that is really impressive. Then here we are at 15 watts, and it's working pretty good. Let's fast forward to this first turn here, and we can take a look at how smooth it is. And it's not bad over here on the left, but it's definitely a lot smoother over here on the right. Now we've dropped that frame time down to about 27, and then we're at about 70 over here on the right when we're generating frames. You can see our average, our base frame rate on both, we're at about 38, and then we're losing about 6 down to 32 over here on the right. And I was just realizing how smooth even the animation looks. That's pretty amazing. If you look over here, it's a lot smoother. The running animation, definitely a little bit blurrier, but looks a lot smoother. Here we are at 30 watts, and now we're seeing 80 FPS in this game. On the original preset 900p, there's 85. That is pretty high, amazing frame rate. Then over here on the left, we're at about 50 frames per second. And for our frame time, we're at around 20 versus about 50 milliseconds on the right. And I think I probably ran too many tests, but these are going to be nice to have a comparison when those official drivers come out, as well as updates to see if they are able to fix that frame generation lag. And here I've zoomed in 150% just so y'all can see it a bit better. This is going to be really hard for y'all to see on the device with the smaller screen, but if you look at the rocks and everything, it's quite a bit blurrier. Even though that does look close, if you look over here, you can see we're getting like artifacting and blurriness, and it's just weird. Let's do it at half speed here, and it looks strange. Even the way the tree's generating here, if you look over here, see this tree? Looks just normal, and this one's just going berserk. So there's just a lot of weirdness with frame generation. I just think it needs a bit more time for sure. For Horizon Zero Dawn, you wouldn't want to really play at 12 watts. You can see our latency is extremely high at over 100 with frame generation on, and our FPS is also too low even with it off at 24 FPS. So we'd be looking more at 15 watts where we're getting almost 40 FPS with frame gen off at 26 milliseconds, and then 63 FPS with 71 milliseconds of delay with frame gen on. At 30 watts, we're at 50 FPS with 20 milliseconds of delay with frame gen off. And when we turn it on, we go all the way up to 86. We're still getting 42 milliseconds of delay, which is quite a bit. It's actually the same amount of delay at 30 watts with frame gen on that we're getting at 12 watts with frame generation off at only 24 FPS. So the fact that this is the same amount of delay as 30 watts is pretty crazy, and it kind of just shows you how much lag you're going to get when you have frame generation turned on. Next we have GTA 5, and I turned FXAA on and MSAA to X2, and then I turned most of the other settings to high. And then right after leaving the house, if you look on the right, you can see we'll go slow. It's still trying to generate right here, and then it decides to give up. So now it is not generating any frames. So if we rewind that, you can just see the stutter, and you can see right about there. Right there, it's trying to generate frames. So it is going to kick off at a lower frame rate when you have fast motion, but it's really not too noticeable when it kicks off. You can see it, but it's usually just for a brief moment, and then it comes right back on. And it is because we're at a pretty low frame rate. So you can see we're at about 30 FPS. Now we'll take a look at this turn at half speed, and you can see over here, it definitely doesn't look as smooth. It's really nice even with that artifacting. I definitely prefer the smoothness. It just feels like it's a higher frame rate because it is. Now one other thing that's interesting is as we approach this guy, this is an extremely slow motion, but you'll see it'll start almost doubling a lot of pieces. So like watch this, you'll see it's getting a little bit worse, and as he gets closer to the camera, you'll see it kind of fall apart a little bit more. We have multiple people in that shot, and I don't know if that's something you would actually see if you're playing. Probably not. You wouldn't be paying attention to it, but I just thought it was interesting because if we look at the left side and we're passing someone at the same thing, you can see it just stays perfectly clear the whole time because it's not trying to do any type of generation. And we're getting about 60 over here, 38 on the left. The delay is about 27 on the left and about 70 on the right. And here at 15 watts for this same turn we just took earlier, it is not going to kick off. So if we do it really slow, you can see it's generating because we're getting that artifacting the whole time, and I don't see it kicking off at all there for that same exact turn. And we're getting about 100 FPS at 15 watts and about 60 something over here, about 65 with it off, down to 18 milliseconds here, and a little over 50 over on the right. And then we can take a look at this turn again. And once we're already at 60 or so, it doesn't look too much different between them. It's definitely harder to see. Now here we are at 30 watts and we're getting 100 and something, around 120 plus FPS on the right. So butter smooth. This is actually an issue on the Ally though, because you're going outside of the FreeSync range, and it will look worse because you're going outside that range. So it's kind of weird because you want a really high FPS, but you don't want to go out of the 120 hertz range. So it's stuck in this like strange window where you want to be at least 45 FPS, I would say, but then you don't want to be going over 60. So if you had a gaming monitor that was like 165 hertz, it would make it a bit more useful in my opinion. And we are down at 13 milliseconds, about 75 FPS now to 128 FPS. And about 37 milliseconds on the right, so close to 3 times the amount of delay. And for the GTA 5 chart, even at 12 watts, it's a great experience getting in the 40s with 24 milliseconds of delay. with frame generation off. And then when we turn that on, we're at 66, but 71 milliseconds of delay. At 15 watts, we're now in the 60s with frame gen off at only 16 milliseconds for that delay. Turning it on, we do get close to 100 at 98 FPS, but we're at 48 milliseconds of delay. That still could be bearable. And then at 30 watts, we are at 77 FPS, 13 milliseconds with frame gen off. And turning it on, we go all the way up to 123 at about 38 milliseconds of delay. And here's the thing, at 77, it's going to be butter smooth and it's going to be super responsive at 30 watts. And then when you're turning frame generation on, if you're not using an FPS cap, now you're going in and out of that FreeSync range once again. And you're also getting around 3 times the amount of lag. And that's where I think frame generation is a bit of a hard sell right now. I mean, it is free, but it's harder to recommend because it just doesn't seem as practical. If you've played on the Ally at 77, you know with VRR, that's like butter smooth and you're getting this great latency. Next, we have one of the most demanding games, Generation 0. We're just running the medium quality preset at 900p. And this game actually slows down when you're below 30 from my test, so the right side is actually going a little bit slower than the left, but here at 12 watts you can see we're getting about 20-ish or so on both. We're losing a little bit in that base frame rate, but we're getting 43 with fluid motion frames on and about 25 over here on the left. If we take a look at that latency, we're at a little over 40 over here and a little over 100 on the right. Now here at 15 watts, we are maintaining above 30 on both, so they're running about the same speed now, and we are at a little over 60 with the fluid motion frames being generated, whereas we're at about 38 or so over here on the left. And our latency has gone down quite a bit. Now we're at 26 milliseconds. And then over here on the right, we're at a little over 70 milliseconds. So quite a bit of latency still. And you can see our base frame rate took a hit, but the frame time graph, it's actually amazing that it looks smoother over here with the generated frames. And one other thing I wanted to point out, here we are at 30 watts and you can see the screen tearing. Now on the Ally, when you're running FreeSync, you're not going to see this right here. So let me rewind just a little bit. This is screen tearing where it's messing up. Even on the right with the faster frame rate, you can still barely see it. If we rewind here, just for a brief moment, it screen tears right up here. It's actually really hard to see, but right here, it is slightly screen tearing, but that's not how it's going to look on the Ally. So for all these tests, it will even be smoother than what you're seeing here. And at 30 watts, we're at 50-ish for the frame rate over here on the left and almost 100, about 90 right here on the right with fluid motion frames. The latency is looking a lot better at 20 milliseconds on the left. And we're at about 50 milliseconds on the right. And here at half speed, you can see the smoothness difference. So this is 60 frames per second at 50% speed. It's a little bit easier to see, but you can see how smooth it is over here at that 90 FPS. And for our Generation 0 chart, you can see at 12 watts, it's not really playable on either, getting over that 100 millisecond of delay with frame generation on, and then only in the 20 FPS range with frame gen off. So 15 watts is a better place to start, where we get around 36 FPS and 27 milliseconds of delay with frame gen off. And then we're at over 60 FPS with about 70 milliseconds of delay with frame generation on. At 30 watts, this is where I would recommend playing this game for sure. We're in the mid 50s or so for FPS with 18 milliseconds of delay without frame gen. Then turning frame generation on, you're at close to 90 FPS, but you're getting 49 milliseconds of delay. Next, we have Forza Horizon 5 900B, and we're not using any anti-aliasing or resolution scaling, so no FSR, and we're just running the medium graphics preset. And here at 12 watts, you can really see the difference. So let's just rewind a little bit where we get slightly faster motion. We're going to do 50% speed and just look at the tops of these buildings, and you'll just see how much right there. It's not smooth, but watch right here. So we're at 50%, and you can see just how much smoother that is. So if we go back, it's just a lot smoother on the right. It is kicking off though on these fast turns because it just can't handle it. But we're getting about 60 FPS with fluid motion frames when it doesn't kick off. Because of this low frame rate and the fast speed of this game, it frequently is kicking off on turns. But when it's not, 60 FPS versus about 40 over here on the left with 25 milliseconds on the left without frame generation, and about 65 or so over here on the right. And I wanted to zoom into 150% to show you all this. You can see frame generation is working right here, and it's smoother than the left side by quite a bit. So if we look at the comparison over here on the right, it's definitely smoother. However, it's about to kick off for just a second. So right there, it just kicked off. So you can see right here we're getting frame generation, then boom, it kicks off for a millisecond or so, and then we're right back into frame generation. And that's kind of what I'm talking about when we see it kick off and it can't handle it. That's what you experience. It's usually pretty brief, but it's still something you might notice and could be pretty bothersome. Now here we are at 15 watts and we're at about 90 FPS over here on the right. It's dipping down to 80 right here, but right there at 90 again. And then on the left, we're getting about 50, right around 50 FPS, and we're under 20 milliseconds here on the left. So about 18, 19. And then over here on the right, we're at about 51, 52. You can see our base frame rate took a pretty big hit here as well. We're at 55 down to 45. That is a huge impact. That's about 20% at this frame rate. So that is a big loss on the base frame rate. But getting over 90 FPS definitely looks better. In this game though, latency does matter quite a bit. And here at 30 watts, we're at like 120, sometimes going up to 130-ish plus. And here at 30 watts, we're at over 120, and it goes up to over 140 in some areas that are a little less demanding. We're at about 80 FPS on the left, and our frame time is amazing on the left. So we're only getting about 12 milliseconds of delay, whereas we're getting about 30-ish over here on the right. And one other thing I noticed on these benchmarks is the VRAM stays basically the same, as well as the temperature, and even the utilization pretty much doesn't fluctuate in most of the tests. And you can see we're taking a pretty big hit on that base frame rate again at 79 for the average, down to 65. For Forza Horizon 5, it's a great game at 15 watts. You can see we're getting right at 60 FPS with 17 milliseconds of delay. Even with frame gen on at that wattage, we're getting about 96 FPS and 47 milliseconds of delay. Going down to 12 watts is also still playable at 40 FPS with 25 milliseconds. And then we're getting 65 FPS, but 70 milliseconds of delay at 12 watts with frame generation on. Now here's one of the more interesting things. At 30 watts, we're getting 82 FPS, 12 milliseconds of delay. Super responsive. You'll get nice and fluid gameplay. And with frame generation on, we go all the way up to 132. But here's the thing, we're at 35 milliseconds of delay. And that is 10 milliseconds more than 12 watts, where we're only getting 40 FPS. So it is a ton of extra FPS, but there's just so much delay being added. Next, we have Cyberpunk. We're running the medium quality preset. However, I did change FSR to quality. And I love these panning benchmarks here where you can really see the difference. You can see how much smoother it is here at 12 watts. So our base frame rate is at 19 with fluid motion frames on. However, we're getting like 37 with it generating. You can totally see it right here. And then we're getting about 20 over here on the left. And then once again, as we pass this, you will see it kick completely off. So right about here, it is kicking off all the way. You can see it's not generating any frames, and then it's going to go back into generating frames right here. So you can see that's a bit smoother. And then right here, we're getting that just heavy stutter because it's down in that 19-ish frame rate. And just at real-time speed, you'll see it stutters right here. So we're stuttering, and then it went back into fluid motion frames right there. You can see it's quite a bit smoother. Now, is this playable at 12 watts? Not really on either one. You can see 40 milliseconds of delay. Now we're down at like 36 and about 140 milliseconds of delay over here on the right. So it's definitely not going to be too playable. Then if we take a look at the wall, you can see how smooth it is over here. And then right here, you can just see the difference in that jitter. So you can see that low frame rate here. So if we do it again, see it's a lot smoother over on the right. And then here at 15 watts, you can see the smoothness, especially look at the pull table over here on the left when it starts, and you can just see the difference between the left and the right side. And we're getting almost 60 FPS on the right and about 30 on the left. Our frame time has come down quite a bit on the left, so 30-ish milliseconds, and we're at around 80 on the right. And it kind of reminds me of the TVs, if we look right here, just how it smooths everything out, but you get that weird look. I think it's a bit better now on TVs, but I remember when my dad had a TV and I first saw the frame generation, essentially, it looked weird to me. And that's kind of what we see here. It's almost like that first iteration where they need to fix some bugs, and you can just tell the image is a bit off when you're playing. Then here at 30 watts, we're at about 47 FPS on the left without frame generation and 21 milliseconds or so. And then over here on the right, it was at about 80. There we go. So 80 to 90 FPS, and we're getting about 52 milliseconds of delay or so. And it's harder to show the difference here at 80 FPS versus about 45. But if we look at this sign right here, we'll do 25% speed, and you can see how smooth it is over here on the right. And then you can see it's not near as smooth over here on the left. Then for Cyberpunk, even at this 30 watts, you can see we're at 84 FPS with frame generation on, but 52 milliseconds of delay. So I think that's going to be a bit much. So with 30 watts, I would recommend it off, and you get close to 50 FPS at 20 milliseconds of delay. And as we go down from there at 15 watts, you can see we're still at 77 milliseconds of delay with frame gen on at 57 FPS. And with it off, we're still in the mid 30s for FPS at about 29 milliseconds. At 12 watts, neither one's going to be playable. You can see 113 milliseconds of delay. And then with it off, we're only getting 22 FPS and still 45 milliseconds of delay. So this would not be a very good experience. Next up, we have Crysis, and we're just running the medium quality preset. And what's neat here on Crysis, we can actually see the frame generation quite a bit better on the weapon as it goes back and forth. So you can see just that ghosting there. Whereas over here, we're not getting any of that. And this really kind of shows what frame generation is doing, because this is really fast motion here. And at 12 watts, we're getting over 60 FPS with fluid motion frames on the right versus about 42 on the left. Our delays at about 24 on the left and about 72 milliseconds on the right. And our base frame rate here is taking a massive hit again, going from 42 down to 33. And here at 15 watts, you can still see that frame generation on the weapon. So if you look over here on the left, you can see each shot's pretty much crystal clear. And then over here, we're getting those shots where it's generating frames right there. It's kind of hard to see. There you go. But we are getting 95 over here on the right with the fluid motion frames versus about 60 on the left. And now we're down at 17 milliseconds over here on the left. So very playable at 15 watts. And we're at about 48 milliseconds or so over here on the right. Then here at 30 watts, you can see the frame generation is a lot harder to see, especially if we go normal speed right here. You can't really see it too much on the weapon anymore. And we're getting 125 FPS over here on the right versus about 75 on the left. And 13 milliseconds of delay on the left is amazing. And even here on the right, we're getting under 40. So we're getting about 38 or so, 37. So that's pretty good. For Crysis, I was really impressed with the 12 watts. We're getting 42 FPS and around 24 milliseconds of delay. Kicking frame gen on does get us into the mid 60s for FPS with around 70 milliseconds of delay. Going up to 15 watts, this is where I personally play the game, or 17 watts, and we're getting about 62 FPS with only 16 milliseconds of delay. Kicking frame gen on gets us close to 100, but 48 milliseconds of delay. And then at 30 watts without frame gen, we're at mid 70s with about 13 milliseconds of delay. And we're at 130 FPS with about 36 milliseconds of delay with frame gen turned on. Next, we have Ghost Recon Wildlands. This is a harder game to run, and we are just running the medium quality preset. And here we are at 12 watts in real time, and we're getting about 28 for that average right here, but it's just kicking off, and about 23 over here. So still, that's about 50 frames over here at 12 watts with fluid motion frames on, and about 30 over here. And I think this area shows exactly where fluid motion frame struggles the most. You can see these trees it doesn't like, but look back here when objects aren't moving as much, it's still generating these frames and it looks a lot better. Even the rocks right here, take a look at the rocks. It's doing a lot better when it's not around the trees and just a bunch of sharp lines is what it looks like. And that's where in something like Skyrim, I did notice it a lot when running around trees, and there's trees basically everywhere besides if you go into like an open area, and then it looks a lot better, but around trees, it just does not like those as much. And for the delay here, we're at about 30 milliseconds over here on the left and about 90 over here on the right. And here's a really weird finding, and it shows potential. So right here, this is generating frames in this area, and it's crystal clear the whole time. So if you look over here, you can see how laggy it is. We're actually at a lower base frame, but we're getting the full 50 here with almost no artifacting. It's just clear. So there's a lot of potential. If it could do that on the whole image, I think it would be amazing. And right here at the intro at 15 watts, you can really see the difference. It's a way smoother over here. It just looks awesome, but it's also panning really slowly. And we're getting about 70 FPS over here on the right, now about 75. It's fluctuating quite a bit. Then about 42 over here. Our latency is down at 22 milliseconds over here, and right at 60 on the right hand side, or it was at 60, now it dropped a little, now we're down at like 20 over here. And our base frame rate is doing decent, 44 at 15 watts and 37 over here. It is a lot higher in this area versus when it gets more intense like up here. And here we are at 30 watts, and this is where we're getting a strange result. So if you look at the GPU usage, we're at 80% here on the left, and this started happening at 15 watts, but not this drastic. So we're at 80% here and over 90 on the right. And you can see our average frame times are almost the same. It's like 1 FPS or so difference, like 49, so 2 FPS. Usually we're seeing a much bigger performance hit. You can see here we're at about 18 milliseconds of latency. And on the right, we're at about 45, 46. But if you look at the usage, it's this way lower over here on the left. So if I had to guess, I would guess it's probably some type of CPU bottleneck. However, CPU boost is on this. So it's got 30 watts CPU boost. So this is a bit of a bizarre result. And at the end of this benchmark, you can see it's right at only 2 FPS loss, which is almost nothing for that base frame rate. And it's definitely due to this lower GPU utilization we're seeing right here. And for Ghost Recon Wildlands, you can see here at 12 watts, we're already in the 30s at around 30 milliseconds. However, with frame generation on, we're at almost 90 milliseconds of delay, so that's going to be quite a bit too much, even though we're getting 51 FPS. At 15 watts, we're at about 48 FPS, 21 milliseconds with frame gen off. Turning it on, we're going up to almost 80 FPS at around 60 milliseconds of delay. And here's something that's interesting. If we look at the non-frame gen results, you'll see we went from 48 to only 54. Like we were seeing that weird GPU utilization only at 80%. And this is where frame generation really shines, because we're going from 80 to 102. So it's able to just kind of bypass that and just generate the frames and give us a pretty high frame rate. However, we are getting 44 milliseconds of delay at 30 watts with frame generation on and only 18 milliseconds with it off. So I'd probably still prefer this 30 watts and 50 FPS, or maybe even go down to 15 watts in this game, or 17, because we're still close to that 50 FPS range with pretty good latency. Next up, we have a pretty fun benchmark. This was ARK, and it's running the medium preset. However, I turned this resolution scale up, because with that turned down, it just looks way too blurry in my opinion. And here we are at 12 watts. This is 50% speed, and you can definitely see a difference if you look right here. Now the latency at 12 watts on ARK is out of this world. You can see we're at 47 over here, 45, and we're at over 100 milliseconds of delay over here on the right. And it might just be the blurrier graphics in ARK, but it seems to handle it a bit better than some other games, because we're only around 20 FPS over here on the base frame rate, and it seems to work pretty good at this slower pan rate. And where you want to look is over here. You can kind of see just how smooth it is. Here's real time. And we've dropped the latency considerably, going to 15. So now it's at about 30 over here, 25 now, and close to 70 over here on the right. And this is not losing a whole lot in the base frame rate, 33 to 30. That's not near the kind of losses we've seen in some other games. Now here we are at 30 watts, and when we make this first turn, take a look at these trees back here, and you can see how smooth that is. So if we look at the difference, so over here versus this is a lot smoother, and that's because we're at around 70, and now we're at over 80 FPS on the right. The left is at about 44 or so, and we're getting about 23 milliseconds of delay on the left. It's jumping around a lot because ARK changes depending on where you're looking by quite a bit. So now we're at about 20 and 55 or so over here on the right. And once again, the base frame rate is not changing a whole lot. You can see 42 over here to 38. So we're not losing a whole lot, and the GPU is pretty much maxed on both. So it's not doing like what we saw in Wildlands, where it's dropping it over here. It's pretty consistent. And even this turn right here, you can see the artifacting, but if we rewind and fast forward a bit, look at the left versus the right as we make this turn, just the forest part, and you can see the difference in smoothness by quite a bit. So you can see right here. So overall, pretty impressive, but we still are getting quite a bit of latency over here on the right. Next, we have ARK, and you can see here, if we go to Resident Evil 4, these are actually really close, so we can switch back and forth between them. And at 12 watts, not really going to be playable, approaching 110 milliseconds of delay with frame generation, still at over 40 with it off, and down in the low 20s without frame generation. Then at 15 watts, it becomes more playable, but this is a game where you want to bump it even more because we're only in the 30s with 30 milliseconds of delay. Frame generation does get us close to 60 FPS, but at a pretty heavy cost still at almost 80 milliseconds of delay. Then at 30 watts, this is a much more playable experience. We're in the 40s at about 24 milliseconds of delay. Kicking frame gen on, we go all the way up into the mid 70s, but we're still right at 60 milliseconds of delay, which is almost 20 milliseconds more than 12 watts with frame gen off. Next, we have Monster Hunter World, and I am using DirectX 12, and we're using medium settings. A lot of these settings were set to dynamic settings, so they could adjust depending on the frame rate, and I wanted it to be locked down for this test. And for the first test, we're here at 12 watts once again, and this game handles it pretty well. So let's do half speed here, and you can see over here, look at the difference. That is amazing. And maybe it's just because it's mostly rocks over here. We don't have a whole lot of issues for frame generation technology because it seems to be doing well. We'll do real speed real quick. And you can see over here, it looks a lot higher of a frame rate, and that's because we're getting almost 60 versus about mid 30s over here on the left. Once again, the frame time is about 30 on the left. We're at about 80 on the right, and the frame time graph does seem to be struggling a little bit more over here on the right, which is what I thought I would see across all these tests. However, that has not been the case at all. Then here we are at 15 watts. And at over 50 FPS at around 20 milliseconds, this is a great experience. I have played on the Ally at 15 watts, at 17 watts, and it's a joy to play on, especially with VRR and FreeSync. It just makes a huge difference. Over here, you can see we are losing about 10 FPS for that base frame rate, going from about 52 to 42, now 41. And we're getting about 80 with frame generation versus about 50 with it off. And we're at about 60 milliseconds of delay over here on the right versus about 20 on the left. So it's about 3 times the amount of delay with the Fluid Motion Frames. And here at 30 watts, it is smooth on both. It is obviously smoother over here. We're getting 115 FPS with Fluid Motion Frames on versus about 70 on the left. But both of these are pretty smooth. You can see we're at 66 for the base frame versus about 55. And we only have about 15 milliseconds of delay over here versus about 40 milliseconds on the right. And one thing that's strange is the CPU utilization is higher over here on the left. You would think it would be higher over here where Fluid Motion Frames is turned on, but for whatever reason, it's slightly higher here at about 5% or so more on the left-hand side. For Monster Hunter at 12 watts, we're around 34 FPS with about 30 milliseconds of delay with frame generation off. Kicking that on, we go up to about 80 milliseconds of delay and mid 50s for the FPS. And at 15 watts, we're also in the 50 FPS range with frame generation off at only 19 milliseconds of delay. And we go from 52 to 81 FPS with frame generation on, but still at 55 milliseconds of delay. Then at 30 watts, we're in the 60s with 15 milliseconds with frame gen off. And kicking it on, we go all the way up, approaching 110 FPS, but still at about 42 milliseconds of delay. And that about wraps it up for this video. Overall, as you saw, the latency increase is just really high, and it's going to make it pretty difficult to play most games, especially competitive ones, but there's a lot of potential with frame generation, and it's enough that it might be worth trying yourself just to see if you like it. However, if you are sensitive to the input latency and you are noticing the artifacting, it's definitely something that's probably not worth it. And the other thing is with the Ally, we have a VRR display and that has FreeSync Premium. So with low frame rate compensation, it can go all the way down to 30 FPS and then all the way up to 120 FPS. So it makes it a bit less practical because we already are getting that really smooth image even at lower frame rates, specifically on the Ally's display. However, it is exciting times and maybe they will be able to improve it to where it's more usable in the future. And even if they can't on this generation of handhelds, I feel like in the near future, it's going to be a pretty big deal to have frame generation and it's going to be a lot more usable. This video definitely took a little while to put together, so if you did enjoy it, consider hitting the like and sub button, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.